Greg, so when I talk about the pains of imprisonment in class and the massive assault that it represents on the self, or the prison inflicts on the self, the prison experience, the students could care less. You know, they think the more pain, the better. You must have confronted that when you were teaching. How did you respond, and would you respond any differently today to that attitude?
No, I think they used to piss me off because they were young kids who were quite typically unaware of and indifferent to the kind of suffering that went on in the larger community. They had very little sympathy or idea of what criminal lives could be about, and much like the general public, I think they were more concerned with criminals getting their just desserts and receiving punishment and all the rest of it. I don't want to say that I then took a liberal stance and tried to inform them about the poor plight of the prisoners sort of stuff. But I thought simply as a sociologist, trying to be somewhat objective about it, that they ought to be aware of the kinds of things that were going on in the prison, what it was doing to people, just or unjust, kind or unkind. And that I tried to convey to them, yes, I think, without trying to pitch a certain ideological. Of course, when I began teaching, the whole world was so less ideological at that time, I think. There came a time later on when I taught in California at Santa Cruz and so on. The sympathies were very much the other way, very much with the prisoner, against soulless, brutal society. Right. So you catch it from both sides.
Right. You talked about McCorkle and the condemnation of the condemners. I think in your book you referred, this is the same thing, rejection of the rejectors.
Yes, yeah.
Does that explain a lot of crime today? I mean, aside from the prison experience?
I don't know. One time I thought I knew what caused crime, but I think that idea is growing dimmer and dimmer in my head. I was thinking about this, as a matter of fact, when we first thought about doing this interview, about how much we really knew about the causes of crime. And when I first began to think about it, I thought we knew a great deal, and that perhaps we were wasting our time in some of the research we were doing. We'd better turn to something else about how better to deal with it rather than elaboration of its causes. And in some sense we do. I mean, I think poverty, and prejudice, and so on are obvious factors in broken families, or obvious factors in the creation of crime, but it is certainly not a complete and adequate explanation. For one thing, I don't think society recognizes the extent to which everybody in the society is engaged in crime. And that I taught from the very beginning. I said there are all sorts of crime going on. We just don't recognize them or admit them. There's white-collar crime. There's all sorts of vandalism. There is adultery, drunken behavior, drunken driving, and all that. People don't get caught, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And I think our whole picture of crime is vastly distorted by the fact that we deal with crime that comes to official attention and goes through the criminal justice system. And so understanding it as a psychological process is extremely limited.
Yeah. Looking back on your work in the prisons, what do you think are the limitations of your theory and research?
Well, first, I don't think it takes enough into account the variation that exists in prisons. There are many different kinds of prisons, large, small, medium, maximum, and so on. And that is something that has to be addressed. Another thing is that prisons have changed a great deal. The nature of the criminal population has changed. They're younger. There's been a balkanization. There's a much greater racial strife, ethnic strife going on. Drugs are much more important in prison life than they used to be, I think. All of this has changed, made prison, in many cases, much more dangerous, much more difficult to deal with.
Yeah, I've taught criminology and deviance for a number of years now, and I think there are three classic readings that always show up in the readers. And one is Durkheim's on the normal and the pathological, and the other is Kai Erickson's on the sociology of deviance. And the third one is the article you wrote with David Matza on the techniques of neutralization. What is the principal contribution of this article? What accounts for its longevity?
Well, I suspect that people find it useful because it makes the whole idea of how people hold norms more complex and, in a sense, more realistic. And this is an issue that bothered me from the very beginning when I began to work in sociology and in criminology, that we talked about norm holding. But it's a very complex issue of what you mean by that, how people hold norms, what the process is. And I became more and more intrigued by the idea that people hold norms, they have certain rules in their mind, but they violate them. Mm-hmm. And I thought, how can this be? Well, how does this contradiction come into existence? And that was one source of this idea, and I think it's probably one source of its continuing interest, that people realize that people can believe one thing and do another. Mm-hmm. They can hold very strongly to certain values and violate them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the human condition, of human nature. So I think that's been an important factor.
Well, why do people violate the rules in which they believe? I remember that was the question in the article. It's a really good, important question. The techniques of neutralization, the rejection, rejectors, condemnation, the condemners, it strikes me that these also reflect the influence of psychology and cognitive dissonance. You know, I'm a good person, but I'm doing a bad thing. How do you deal with that?
Yes, I think that those ideas were addressed by various other disciplines or other aspects of the discipline. It's true. And I think they continue to be important issues today. I think that sociology and criminology, they tend to be too crude. They use these vast simplifications. And the world isn't that simple. And I think in our haste to make a science, we cut things out. Mm-hmm. And it's why I think we turn back again and again to literature, to movies and so on, for a better grasp of reality. I mean, Dog Day Afternoon, to me, still, is a wonderful sociological essay on crime and its nature, more than what you'll get very often in a textbook. One of the problems is when I started out in criminology, people just didn't talk to criminals all that much.
Right.
And I don't see how you can understand criminal behavior unless you go out and talk at great length to criminals. I think that's, in general, true about sociology. I think that sociology, in its haste to build vast scientific generalizations and abstractions, turns away from the complexities of social reality, and it turns to numbers or some other escape from coming face to face with human beings and trying to see what they do and ask them what they do and to understand it.
Is this a source when we correspond, you referred to your bemusement with the social sciences. Is this the source of that bemusement?
I think so. I think when I started out in sociology after the war, I think there was a tremendous hope that sociology would be a great liberal discipline which would add to the quality of life in society, and that it would be a powerful science. I don't think that promise has been fulfilled. I think in many ways you'd have to say that sociology has been a failure. And I'm not saying it always has to be. I don't believe that human nature is inherently incapable of being understood. I don't take that kind of a position. But I think that many of our present ways of trying to understand human behavior are inadequate. And I think there's this, I think jargon gets in our way of doing something with it. I think relying on people's memory of how they feel instead of observing it firsthand gets in our way. I think this rush to make generalizations gets in our way. All of these things, I think, interfere with a really powerful science. And I think also in many ways, the ideological battles of the 60s got in our way. And people either felt it was absolutely necessary to go left or right. And I think to some extent the same thing is happening today. I think this whole notion of postmodernism and politically correctness get in our way of really trying to come to grips with social reality.
So in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, sociology was showing promise and then it got sidetracked? Is that?
Well, I think that before the Second World War, a number of very important ideas were developing. They were Freudian ideas, Marxist ideas, and so on. The war put a kind of a stop to the development of the social sciences. After the war, these ideas were picked up and examined more closely. And I think by and large they didn't pan out. I think Marxian ideas proved to be too rigid, doctrinaire and all the rest of it. And I think Freudian ideas turned out to be not the great scientific hope that people had wanted. That really brought us into the 60s. At that time, the whole field became much more politicized, I think. We went through a period of the 60s when a number of social experiments were tried using sociological ideas. They didn't work. They were not very effective.
What kind of experiments?
Well, I forget the name of the projects now, but some of the ideas about dealing with juvenile delinquency by opening up opportunities and so forth and so on. And I think they were too simple a notion of how you could deal with problems of juvenile delinquency. Because I think many of these things, they come from family, they come from the political situation, they come from community structure, they come from housing, they come from education. And taking one simple theme and saying, here's how I'm going to deal with it, is inadequate. I think you have to take it from a great many different stances simultaneously. But I was very much struck in the 70s by a great shift in criminology. I noticed at that time, and the sociologists just lost ground. In came a bunch of political scientists who said, well, now we have the handle. And it was very much a conservative, a reaction against the liberalism, I think, of the 60s. That didn't work very well either, as a matter of fact, although people think it did. Now people say we're having a declining crime rate, and it's all due to our get tough stance, but I'm very suspicious of those arguments as well.
You've written, the social sciences have unquestionably suffered from an amazing hubris as far as their power to change social reality is concerned. I read this and I'm suffering an existential crisis. What do you tell people who want to make the world better, who want to study sociology? You tell them to go into something else, or?
No, I'm very fond of sociology. I think many of us, after the Second World War, had all sorts of idealistic and rather arrogant notions about how we were going to reform the world, make it a better place. And I don't think it worked out quite the way we expected. In fact, I'm somewhat appalled at what has happened in many ways to American society, given the hopes that we had 40 years ago. I think sociological can be a great liberating discipline and enlightening field of study. But also I would be a little bit skeptical of what's happening in universities today in the name of sociology. I think sociology is fragmented into 1,000 bits and pieces. There's no sense really what the discipline consists of anymore, what things are necessary to study and so on. That's all very disturbing.
On an upbeat, what's the most satisfying aspect of your career, or what has been? Well,
We managed to accomplish a few good political acts. I think one of them was Legal Aid for the Poor, which was a program I ran in Denver, which I think was a good idea. Another one, which had to do with the law school, was not so much criminology. When I first went to teach in a law school, I was very interested in the LSAT and whether it was a particularly useful means of admission. And so I did some studies of how LSAT scores were related to performance in law school, and I found there was very little correlation. Didn't seem to make much difference. That's not to say that a good score on the LSAT wasn't kind of a threshold cutting point. Below that, you might not do too well. But variation much above that was not all that important. And that gave us an idea. We thought there are a lot of people who would like to go to law school, but whose LSAT scores are not all that good. But perhaps the best way to find out is to send them to law school, see what happens. And so we said, let's set up a situation where a lot of Chicano kids in Denver can go to a summer program. If they do well in that summer program, then they can go on to law school and use that instead of the LSAT as a way of determining admissions to law school. And it worked very, very well. I've always been pleased by that. And it seems to me that is one of the kinds of themes that also connect to my art. I just did a picture of a pig holding with his paw on a black ball, and it's called the chairman of admissions. And I still, the pig has a very happy and sardonic look on its face. but I think there's some suspicion of our means of allowing entrance into the system.
Now, what have you left undone? If you could do it again, what would you do differently?
I would be much more skeptical about the social sciences. I think I accepted much too much, and I think I would be much more critical in the ideas that were presented. I don't know how that would work. I mean, I say that. I'm not sure it's a very effective way to go about things, but I think I accepted a great deal now, uncritically, that I would. Also, I'd be much more of a scholar than I was. I think when you look at a person's career, you have to see how there's a real need for continuing study and analysis, and I think that I neglected that, and that's something I would do differently.
Well, you're retired now. What do you do with your time?
I paint. I very happily engaged full-time as an artist, and very glad to be doing it.
Oh, good. Good. Now, is there a crossover between criminology and painting? Is Sykes the criminologist reflected in Sykes the artist?
I cannot find very many ties between them, really.
Oh. I think that's about it. Are there any questions I didn't ask that you would like to answer anyway?
No, I think that's
Okay.
very fine.
Okay.
Okay?
Bob,
Okay.
let me get up to speed here. And again, about 4 seconds of nodding before you go for the question, and go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Start nodding.
Okay. You told me about your experience in the prisons. How often did you go? What was the situation like? Did you ever feel you were in danger?
Well, I went over there pretty much once a week for 2 years. And that, I think, in itself was important. I think a lot of sociological research consists of getting together a questionnaire and then having somebody else administer it. And I don't think you really get to the heart of the experience that you want to examine. But I think that long and relatively unstructured kind of visiting was very important. I got a chance to talk to the guards. I had lunch with them. I saw them at parties after the end of the day. I talked to a great variety of inmates over a long time. Things happened in the prison. I could follow the events up over time and get different slants on how people reacted to it. So that kind of long-range interviewing, I think, is very important.
Did you make friends with some prisoners,
Some
guards?
of the prisoners I got to be very friendly with. One of them, a young guy, was a very good informant, came to my house later on after he was released, and we used to have some long talks. He was a guy who had shot a man in a holdup. He had a gun, he had it cocked, and his finger slipped. It was an accident. And I believed him. That's what he said, and I believed him. He was given a life in prison, finally. But the life in prison is 8 years. Life in prison, most sentences at that time. And he got out. He came to see me. I was living in Princeton. He was trying to make a living selling pencils and pens. I didn't think there was going to be much chances for a very successful career. And it was kind of tragic. He said when he went back to his community in Newark, the people pointed and said, "There goes the murderer." You know, and you think, what kind of a chance does he have in this situation?
Right. Well, how did you select your informants?
Actually, I drew a random sample of inmates and interviewed them. I threw all that material away. I didn't use it in any explicit fashion. But it did give me a variety of inmates to go and talk to. I had started out, as I said earlier, trying to do a kind of a study of rehabilitation and so on. And that's when I'd use this more structured way of going at it, but I had found it not a particularly effective way of gathering information.
But what surprised you most when you went into the prison? You must have had certain preconceptions, and then you went in and...
I think that, as I said before, some of the things like inmates playing cards, the friendly relationships between guard and inmates, those things really I hadn't expected at all. I didn't realize that they were there.
What about in terms of the inmates' personalities?
Well, I think, yes, I grew to realize how complex people were, and that the idea of trying to categorize them under some simple title like murderer or something just didn't make any sense. And I think I learned something about that people are very, very complex, and that no simple category is going to catch their lives or their personality.
You speak very fondly of Lloyd McCorkle.
Yes.
What else did you learn from him?
Well, I learned a lot. We used to go out, when there was going to be an execution, he hated those. And when they were finished, he'd come over, we'd go out and get drunk, and go roaring around the countryside at night in his souped-up Mercury with his dual exhaust. And it's a way of knowing your informant, that goes beyond sitting in an office and talking for 15 minutes. So it's
What about the guards? What impressed you about the guards you spoke to?
One of the things that impressed me about the guards there was their honesty and their real dedication to trying to do a good job, and their real sense of being threatened by the situation. They knew they were in a terribly rough job. I didn't find the guards brutal. Now, this is not to say this is universal true. There are prisons in which the guards' behavior is absolutely incredible. But that wasn't true at the New Jersey prison when I was studying it. And I don't think it's true at many institutions. The whole question of who goes into prison work is an interesting question. Very often it is kind of when you can't get a job anywhere else, you try and go get a job in the prison. And when times get good and employment picks up, people drop out of prison work. And that does lead to really severe problems for the prison, maintaining a stable, well-trained, experienced guard.
I think they get paid more than teachers or something in California.
Look what happens to teachers.
You ever get an urge just to drop in on a prison sometime?
Not anymore. I went to a prison in Puerto Rico, which was really quite fascinating. And I've been to some others, but I think prisons have become much more dangerous now than they used to be, and I would be very cautious about putting myself into some of these situations. There was a time not too long past when I was beginning to do a paper on jails. I found I couldn't get anywhere with it, but I went down to the jail in Washington, which I found interesting, but it was not the same experience at all. It was very different, and I was sort of surprised at that. Part of it, I think, is your enthusiasm and your ability to see. It's great the first time around, but it's not so good the second time around.
No.
And you can't do as good a job. It's the freshness and the sharpness of the experience and its impact on you that breeds ideas and gives you real motivation for it.
Do you think we can ever look toward the prisons for rehabilitation?
Yes. I think that despite the studies which show that most of the things we do are almost worthless, I think it is possible that you can do rehabilitative work in prison. I think one of the problems is that by and large we really haven't put enough money into it and time, and that the programs are not particularly good, and they're beset by all sorts of difficulties. But I think for prisoners who want it, they can be a real benefit. And I think it's a tremendous mistake to throw up our hands and say the whole thing is hopeless. I think we keep people in prison much too long, and that's one of the very severe problems.
Well, these are bad times to be expecting
That's right.
anything really great from the prisons with the public attitudes toward crime.
That's true, and I would think a change in the social and political climate in this country will make a difference. The other thing is, I think the sheer expense of running these institutions is going to become more and more burdensome, and they're spending more on prisons than they are on education.
So I think the pendulum will swing back.
I think yes. I don't think this can continue. I think there'll come a point when it's going to have to reverse itself.
What about prisons in other countries? You know anything about how we fare or compare?
Well, at one time I was very much interested in some of them, in Germany, in England, in Puerto Rico, and so on. But I never did any systematic work on it, and I think that's a very necessary part of our understanding of prisons, that we need more of those studies to get a more of a comparative viewpoint on it.
And you never did answer my question about the danger,
Well,
the sense of danger, impending doom.
by and large, I didn't have that. Occasionally, I would get a sensation of that. I remember one time I was going to do some interviewing in a recreation hall at night. There were 1,000 men in there. It was extremely dark, and I was way back at the end of this recreation hall. There were no guards around anything, and I suddenly wondered what the hell would happen if a riot started up.
Yeah.
But by and large, at that time, I didn't feel very much threatened. Now, however, I think I would feel much more so, and I would be very reluctant to put myself into some situations.
Your textbook, Criminology,
Mm-hmm.
I think it did very well, and I think it was very different from the other textbooks on the market. It seemed more philosophical, got into more of the ethical questions and legal questions.
But now it's dead. So that's its fate.
Why do you think? Why do you think
I don't know
people aren't
exactly.
interested in that?
I think there's been a big change in criminology, my impression is, and it's gone toward much more toward the more practical and applied aspects of it, and the more philosophical and historical interest in it has diminished, and I think my textbook is no longer as relevant for people, which is too bad.
Which is too bad.
Yes, well, I feel so.
Well, what about criminology's place in sociology?
Well, apparently it is in great danger. Some places cut out criminology, or it goes off by itself and is no longer considered to be sociology. It's another kind of thing. I think that the funding of criminology has something to do with that. And they set up these special schools, special departments for it. And I think it's too bad. I think there's been a long tradition of a link between sociology and criminology in this country, and I think intellectually it would be very important to maintain that link.